Hi, my name's Alistair Chapman, and in this video I'm going to take a look at why I choose to shoot with ProRes Raw with my FS5 whenever possible. Now, ProRes Raw is something that's being discussed a lot on the internet already, and let's get a few things clear from the get-go. First of all, ProRes Raw won't give you any extra dynamic range. I wouldn't expect it to. Nor is it going to improve your low light performance, because these things are all governed by the sensor that's in your camera and the lenses that you're using. But what ProRes Raw does give you, especially with the FS5, is more data. Now with the FS5, when you shoot in UHD, you record using 8-bit XAVC, and an 8-bit codec can at the most have 256 shades or steps. And normally when you're shooting with log or something like that, with S-Log2, you'll actually get about 235 luminance shades. Now when you shoot with ProRes Raw with the FS5, you record that on your Atomos Inferno, what you get is up to 4096 luminance shades. That's 4 times the data, 4 times the picture information. So while the dynamic range isn't greater, what's within that range has a lot more detail and more textures, more steps. So my workflow for this has been to shoot first of all with the ProRes Raw using picture profile number 7, the recommended way to do it, and then to immediately record the same thing using XAVC in 8-bit internally. For the internal recordings I used S-Log2. Why S-Log2? Well, because S-Log2 uses the full recording range. S-Log3 doesn't. So if you've only got 8 bits, you want to use S-Log2 because that will give you the best data possible on those 8-bit recordings. Now the first thing to note, and I was actually a little bit surprised by this, is that the ProRes Raw, without any additional grading, has much less of the magenta tint to skin tones that XAVC has. Now the Sony camera is a little bit known for this magenta tint, and it's not really the most pleasing of looks. The ProRes Raw has a much reduced tint, and as a result, on skin tones, the ProRes Raw just looks nicer before we do anything else. If you look at the mannequin, you can see how the right side has a distinct magenta tint, while the left side has much more natural looking skin tone. Now while you're looking at this close up, you might also say, well, hang on, wait, look at the noise in the ProRes Raw on the left side. There is some noise in the ProRes Raw, but it's fine-grained noise that will clean up nicely with a bit of noise reduction if you feel it's necessary. Things get really interesting though if we take an even closer look. The ProRes Raw has that fine-grained, filmish-like noise, while the XAVC has some unpleasant coloured and blocky noise. This is likely a result of the lack of tonal values in that 8-bit recording, as well as compression artifacts. The XAVC is much more highly compressed than the ProRes Raw. Also note the reduction of the textures on the mannequin's lips. We'll see more of this in a moment. In this sky shot we see something similar. The noise in the XAVC is blocky, while the ProRes Raw noise is smoother. Now if you look at the waveform, this gets really interesting because you clearly see the steps in the 8-bit XAVC recording that are just not there in the 12-bit ProRes. Well, what about skin tones? Well, I'm afraid you're going to have me for a model. I've boosted the contrast a bit here, a little bit of a grade, but it's not particularly aggressive. What we see here is something similar to the first clip. Blocky colours in the XAVC, but much nicer, smoother gradients in the ProRes Raw. And no, actually the XAVC shot isn't out of focus. I've triple checked this. I actually moved forwards and backwards when I shot this to make sure that I had it in sharp focus. It's softer because it's more highly compressed. Notice how the lack of bits in the 8-bit XAVC means that there are fewer textures to my skin tones. Both the highlights and shadow areas of my face almost appear smoothed in the XAVC, while the ProRes Raw contains all the subtle, perhaps ugly textures that there is on my skin. And I've kept the best example till last. Same exposure for both shots and both graded to the same levels. I'll show you the waveforms in a moment. Just look how much better the textures are in the 12-bit RAW compared to the XAVC. My hand has a more plastic look in the XAVC because of those lack of tonal values. And again, it looks blurry and softer in the XAVC because it's more highly compressed. Here are the scopes for that shot, and as you can see, the levels are almost identical across the whole range for both the XAVC and ProRes Raw. I'm not cheating here. Notice again how you can see the steps in the 8-bit XAVC. Not just in the highlights, but if you look closely, it's throughout the entire image range. You can clearly see the big steps that that 8-bit recording has. So there you have it. They are small differences. They're not great big differences. But that extra detail in the skin tones in particular, those extra tonal values really do make it much easier to grade the ProRes Raw material. I think it looks a lot less plasticky, a lot more natural, more film-like perhaps. And don't forget as well that ProRes Raw gives you the ability to do things like shooting at 120 frames per second in 4K. So whenever I can, I will use ProRes Raw. You have to expose it correctly, you have to do it right, but when you do it right, I think it looks really fabulous and really makes the FS5 into a much better camera than it is without it.